Hello and welcome to Tower Talk, vital conversations from Prospect Park United Methodist Church in Minneapolis. I'm Dave Nyberg. These programs are designed to take a look at the issues of the day through the lens of the members of Prospect Park UMC, along with others from the greater Twin Cities community. Joining us on this edition of Tower Talk is Cathy Velasquez Eberhart. Cathy is a board member of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, and she's also a charter member of the United Methodist Church Earthkeepers program. Cathy, welcome to the program.
Thanks. I'm honored to be here.
There are obviously countless organizations involved in the effort to address climate change. Some folks may be surprised that faith communities are also deeply involved in the issue of climate change around the world, including here in the Twin Cities and through Prospect Park UMC. You've had a lifelong respect for the environment, but it's really been in the past 8 to 10 years that you have taken a leadership role in the issue of climate change and eco-justice. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. As you know, I grew up the daughter of two United Methodist pastors in South Dakota, and my father grew up on a farm, and my uncles and cousins still farm. So I really came to environmentalism through farming, really. And for 11 years also, I had the great opportunity to work with Land Stewardship Project, which is a Minnesota group that works in sustainable farming and sustainable communities. And I learned just a lot there, and I loved working with that organization. So it was kind of strange after being there for 11 years to feel some nudges to leave that. But my husband Guillermo and I had started a small fair trade coffee business that sells the coffee grown by his family in Honduras. And so I wanted more time to support that. But I also was feeling hungry to, even though I was working with an environmental organization, I was hungry to find more ways to be more sustainable in my own living, not just working for an environmental organization, but living in that way. And so in like 2009-ish, we started at Prospect Park several conversations on energy, local food, plastics, water usage, and so forth. It was kind of a support group for sustainability. It was really, really lovely. And so then fast forward just a few more years, and I was starting to get even more worried about climate change and what people are now calling the climate crisis, and realizing kind of how terrifyingly we were moving toward kind of a point of no return, that we were destabilizing our planet through the emissions of greenhouse gases. And so in that kind of dark moment of despair, I turned back to the church again, back to my church community, to Prospect Park community. And in that point, Dave, I know that you were here, you and Pastor Chris, and we developed together as a community a timely topic series on a faithful response to climate change. And it really focused on kind of a lot of the positive solutions around how we might start to address climate change. So at that point, I had not intended to take that much further than that, but it was about that time I was invited to participate in the first Be the Spark training that Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light offered. And that's really what launched me into kind of this faith-based climate work and what I'm doing today through MNIPL and through the larger United Methodist Church.
So you're a perfect example, Cathy, of somebody who heard that calling and responded, not knowing where it was going to lead, and here you are now as a board member of MNIPL and also a member with the Earthkeepers program, and moving forward as a leader.
Right. Had not expected that it would take that kind of turn, but certainly it was a sense of following a sense of calling, following that urge.
Yeah. Great. So let's talk a little bit about MNIPL, Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. As we mentioned, you're a member of the board of directors of MNIPL. Tell us a little bit about the organization and the work that they do.
Yeah, so Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light is the local chapter of a national organization, Interfaith Power and Light, that has chapters all over the country. Here in Minnesota, but each one is a little unique and it's different. And the one here in Minnesota identifies its mission as working to build an interfaith movement to address the climate crisis. And they work in partnership with faith communities, interfaith, across the different faith groups that are here in Minnesota. And the effort is to build transformative power and to bring the lights of people's unique gifts to this work. So it really is about identifying leaders and identifying the gifts of different congregations doing development programs like Be the Spark that I participated in to help people find that energy, that spark to start to take.
Sure. Can you give us an example or two of some of the programs that churches are involved with and that MNIPL has put forward?
Yeah, there's a lot of things, and they kind of range in two areas. One is leadership development opportunities, and another is really action opportunities. We kind of call them on-ramps to action, that a lot of folks are really passive allies, passive supporters in terms of this climate work and need an action step to take. So a lot of the work in that leadership area are things like the Be the Spark training and a movement builder program that is really seeking to increase the numbers of leaders across the state. And there's also a climate justice congregations planning program and a climate justice households opportunity. So that kind of just gives those opportunities for leadership and change. And then kind of on the action side, there's those change as the opportunities evolve, but MNIPL offers work around solar resources for households and congregations. They're doing work around advocacy. There's a climate justice voter campaign that's really interesting right now in terms of getting folks to start to have conversations in preparation for the election. And also working to support clean transportation and 100% renewable energy at the state. And then working in coalition with groups to fight like the Line 3 pipeline as well, in a different kind of systemic work that they're working on.
Right. So really all about bringing all of these different groups together to move forward in their own unique ways.
Right. And doing that in partnership with the larger climate movement, but really bringing the faith communities to that larger movement and bringing our unique communities and our unique skill sets and resources to the problem, to the climate issue.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kathy, talk a little bit about the importance of leadership. I know you mentioned that it's one of your areas of focus with MNIPL. Why is that important?
Yeah, and I think when I joined MNIPL on the board, so I'm almost on like year 7 now. There was a need to really revitalize the movement, to really grow the movement, and there was a recognition that based on good, solid organizing, particularly from Marshall Gantz as an organizing scholar and movement builder model, that what we needed to do was train more leaders to then train more leaders to train more leaders. It's sometimes referred to as a snowflake model. So you can imagine the center is kind of the core staff and board, and then we're training more leaders across the community, and then they're in turn training other leaders, and it's growing the movement. And that's really what it's been exciting to see that actually happen, and to see the movement just really take off and the energy start to build as more and more people come to this work.
Yeah. Any way to quantify the impact that MNIPL has had here in the Twin Cities or across the state?
I wish I knew the numbers. Certainly, in really a large increase in the numbers of people involved and engaged. There's new what we're calling new regional networks that have developed in Duluth, in Rochester, St. Paul, the South Metro, West Metro, where like groups of congregations are coming together to work together. There's also kind of the growth of denominational circles, and I'll talk more later about the United Methodist aspect of that, but within different faith groups, whether the Muslim group faith, the Jewish faith, other mainline Christian denominations, there's growth in the numbers of people involved and the kind of structure. And where that's starting to show up is when there's something like Line 3, or we need to get people to show up at a rally or at the Capitol or write letters or sign a letter. There's just much more in terms of the numbers of people showing up and being able to speak to take action. So
the issue of eco-justice, and it almost feels minimalistic to call it an issue, because it impacts each and every one of us. Eco-justice, but why is it an issue that the faith community is and should be and could be involved with in such a dynamic way?
That was such a good question. When I first saw it, I was like, of course it just should. Like, why do I even have to answer that question? It just felt like so core, but it forced me to answer it. And I would say that like there's a couple things. One, on the one hand, that the toxic relationship we have with the natural world and with each other really demands a moral response. If we believe that creation is good, as it says in Genesis, then we need to speak up when we see that goodness destroyed. But I think the other thing I'm really excited about in terms of why faith communities are needed right now is that the climate movement really, really needs the resources and gifts that the faith communities offer. We need places to grieve what's already been lost.
Sure.
We need places to hear those transformative stories about our traditions that really give us the wisdom. Like, how do we face this really challenging problem and this hard times? What are those lessons that we can bring from our traditions about healing, about restoration? And so I think the movement really needs the church, really needs all of our faith traditions to bring the gifts that we have and to apply them to this moment.
And I would have to think that hope is a big part of that as well, right? The hope that a faith community brings.
Right. The ability to vision something that isn't yet here. We had that just in the sermon this last Sunday in terms of the kingdom of God. What is that vision of that future that we want to work toward? And even if we're not sure we'll get there, we still know what direction we're going in. That also, I think, is really important. I mean, and I think the other thing that I think, at least I find it particularly in our tradition as the United Methodist Church, and I'm sure it's true in other faiths, but is the sense of calling people to a mission, to a purpose, that we're called in our tradition for the healing and transformation of the world. And if that's what we're feeling, and then to support that and really name that for people as a new identity, as a way of being in the world. So I think we call people to action, and we need more people. So that's right. That's a skill. That's a resource.
Great. Well, Cathy, you were also involved, speaking of the United Methodist Church, with the UMC Earth Keepers program, and Creation Justice. Talk about the denomination's efforts in the whole area of creation care and eco-justice.
Mm-hmm. And this is an area that's really evolving, really in an excited way. And so, well, first of all, I just say, like, growing up as a preacher's kid, like, that's been long believed that the church is one of the ways that I'm uniquely positioned in the world. This is this institution that I have these connections to. And mm-hmm. So it felt very natural for me to show up in this space and work in this church. So there's, of course, lots of good places to work on climate, but for me, it was the church. This particular denomination is the right place to work. The United Methodist Church, for those that don't know the structure, it's really a big institutionalized movement. It's a big snowflake. It's a connected network of annual conferences, and then within those annual conferences of local churches. And so it's also a really big network that can be used and mobilized. And so through that connectional system, a number of us here in Minnesota who were concerned about all of these things found each other over the years. And we worked together with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light to think about ways to recruit more leaders and train. And out of that, and not just from Minnesota, but from the national organization, this Earth Keepers program emerged as a way to initiate, to train and to call forth the callings of more people across the United Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. And so we've really begun to kind of build that network. And beyond the Earth Keeper program, there are institutions of the church and society, United Methodist Women, and so forth, that are also in the midst of working on creation justice work. And so we sought a way to start to bring those together. And that's what's starting to emerge as the United Methodist Creation Justice movement, which is even bigger than the Earth Keeper program.
Okay, so what is your role as an Earth Keeper? What do you have as your responsibilities, as it were?
Yeah, well, each Earth Keeper really identifies their own project and calling based on what they're called to do. Some are working just in their local, they're working powerfully in their local congregations. Others are finding that calling to work in their communities or in their annual conference. And then others are finding a role, and that's where I've kind of landed in connecting Earth Keepers across the network. And so to me, it's really kind of interesting that just in the last really 4 years, this has all emerged. In 2016, we had the first group of about 40 Earth Keepers who met for the first time in Atlanta, Georgia, and we were commissioned. And since that initial training, there have been a number of other regional trainings. And then here in Minnesota, again, leaders creating more leaders, we've in Minnesota started to train more, and we have over 80 Earth Keepers now just in the Minnesota Annual Conference, and there's others in the other annual conferences across the country. So I've helped with some of those trainings, and have helped support and network those other Earth Keepers, and we've also promoted efforts like within the Minnesota Annual Conference, things like fossil fuel divestment and encouraging congregations to do energy audits. So we've strategized like what might we do together that could have some impact. So that's kind of where my story was up until about 2018. And a number of us from Minnesota went out to Washington, D.C. for the Climate March and for the Creation Care Summit, a Creation Care Conference that was being held at the same time within the United Methodist Church. And they, knowing that there were a number of Earth Keepers here in Minnesota, they asked us if we would host the next one, the next event. Oh. So a number of us got roped into organizing the Creation Care Summit in 2018 here in St. Paul. And as you know, Dave, you and Pastor Chris participated in leading some of the worship there, which was really delightful to bring my local congregation into this national movement in such a profound way. And so then that led to me helping organize for the 2019 summit in Nashville. And out of both of those summits, there's this team that's emerged, an advisory team and a number of small work groups. So here I find myself now in this kind of United Methodist Creation Justice Movement advisory team. We've built a communications team that is doing newsletters and a website, social media presence, and we're planning for another now online summit, and also just kind of bringing in those connections across the movement. So yeah, my role as an Earth Keeper has really evolved over time, and it's right now it looks a lot like that kind of national organizing in staying, while I'm still staying connected to the Minnesota Earth Keepers here as well.
It's very much the way that hearing you describe it, Cathy. I mean, it is very much it's about the grassroots level, working on the grassroots level, organizing on the grassroots level, being aware of the issues on a grassroots level, and what can be done to address whatever those issues might be. Correct?
Absolutely. We're not waiting for the church per se to, so many people have come to this somewhat frustrated that the church hasn't taken more action, and instead to say, well, we are the church, like what can we bring to this? Who do we know? What are the relationships we can build? What resources can we offer? Not waiting for kind of permission from our bishop, although we do have the support of our bishop here in Minnesota, but like not necessarily waiting for somebody to develop the program, but really getting to work and developing it.
Yeah. Cathy, let's talk a little bit about the term EcoJustice, and maybe I should have had you define that toward the beginning of the program. Let's talk about EcoJustice and what exactly does that mean? The term EcoJustice.
Yeah, you're going to see lots of versions of that. EcoJustice, environmental justice. You'll notice that we've chosen to call our group Creation Justice, not Creation Care. You'll often hear people talking about climate justice. So it's really, any of those versions are really an acknowledgement that we understand that the work of repairing this planet is inextricably related to the work of repairing our relationship with each other as humans. So that, the way that we're treating and hurting each other is the same mindset that's allowing us to hurt this planet. And, that direct relationship between human justice and planetary health, and, that we can't really solve one without solving the other. It is one big thing, as opposed to working on environmental things here and social justice things here. They really have to be addressed and acknowledged together. And that's been really exciting to see that evolve over the last few years in terms of building the coalition and building the movements in really exciting, aligning all these interconnected causes. So,
So to extrapolate that just a bit further, taking eco-justice, how does it relate to other societal issues and major issues that we're dealing with, such as racism and poverty in our society? How are those connected?
Yeah, well, I think it's been long understood that marginalized communities are those that have been impacted the most by environmental degradation and climate change. Like that's people of color and other marginalized communities are really being hit the hardest. And I think we're also starting to understand on the other side more clearly that those same systemic forces that are violently hurting people of color the most are also some of the same violent forces that are preventing us from really making the change we want to see. So that the forces of systemic racism and economic injustice are limiting the ways that people can respond. Not as many people who care, who want to be involved, can be involved, and the same groups that are kind of preventing that. So there's a sign-on letter just now recently that Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light is putting out in coalition, in connection with a larger coalition around linking police brutality and the Line 3 pipeline. And it really states very nicely how the same kind of police enforcement and violent response to protest that we saw in response to the protests around George Floyd's killing, that's the same kind of thing that's happening when people protest a pipeline. There's that same forces of kind of police brutality and systemic law enforcement that way. And so they're just starting to be more and more of those links being understood and the relationships being built so that we can address it together.
Mm-hmm. You have been a part of the or a church community, the church as a whole, since your earliest days. As far as the role of the church in dealing with eco-justice, how much of an impact can we have?
Well, I think it's the same as how can any group of people can have. First of all, it's just it's a big network of a lot of people that's connected. So to that extent, we can call and access and connect to a lot of people to take action. But I think the church specifically in our faith communities bring this kind of moral authority, this moral voice that to some extent gives it an additional power, that the traditions, all of our faith traditions and the authority of those stories and that moral voice really does have power and can make a difference. It's already had, in terms of sign-on letters and pastors and imams and rabbis speaking on the Capitol steps, and so it brings a kind of a moral authority that is unique.
Mm-hmm. Right. What do you say to a person who may make the comment, you know what, this is like way too big of an issue. I can't do anything as an individual. How would you respond to that kind of comment?
Yeah, well, I really understand that. I mean, that's really where I was 8 years ago, in kind of despair. And what I started to recognize was that if we started to look at, at first it felt like nobody was doing anything. And then I realized that a lot of people were doing a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And then it became a choice of like, where do I start? And so I think the question I would pose back to people who are considering that would be like, first of all, what are you good at? What do you love doing? And then where are you kind of uniquely positioned? Where do you have the relationships and the connections in the network? And start there. So one of the tools that Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light offers is this kind of three-legged stool to action that talks about practical actions, systemic actions, and spiritual or relational actions, and that we need all of them. You'll in some of the resources that are on the website, they're pretty prevalent. And so if you start with, okay, what am I good at? What connections do I have? And let's think about, okay, what's a practical thing we could do? What's a systemic thing we could do? What's some relationship building that we need to do? And start there, and you've got a plan, right? So, and so, whether you start in your household, which is kind of what we did, or workplace or city, or want to jump into some of the things that are happening in the state. I mean, it's whatever feels the easiest in terms of context, but that those tools, and I guess I'll lift up again, there's a new climate justice households program that MNIPL has put out that really gives a framework for people to just take it into their household and say, oh, here's our situation.
Okay.
And, here's those three things: practical, systemic, relational, and then give some suggestions on how to start. So, if you didn't know anywhere else to start, maybe starting with something like that.
Great. We can't leave without bringing, I can't leave without bringing up the topic, the impact of young people. Talk a little bit about, from your experience, the role of young people in EcoJustice, in working toward climate change, or in terms of effectively dealing with climate change. What impact are they having, and what is their role?
Yeah, it's really inspirational and exciting. That's, I think it brings, much like the faith communities, it brings kind of a moral voice that can't be ignored. When you're saying, this is my future, and there's some research that shows that the voices that will impact older men the most are their daughters. So that's like, if you really want to get to that demographic, talk to their daughters, and the daughters can get through, kind of thing. So I guess the way I've seen it is Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light's done a good job of developing youth programming. There's a Be the Spark youth programming, and then there's also some children's programming, with the idea that particularly in intergenerational congregations, that the youth are walking alongside the adults. And so it isn't up to the youth to do all the work, but the youth can say, hey, this is important to us, walk with us. Help us make this happen. And then that motivates and pulls along their parents and their grandparents. And I've been in many meetings where I've seen older men tear up about their grandchildren, that is their motivating factor for giving everything to this work. And so it's, you can't ignore that kind of inspiration in terms of the future, that it brings a real moral clarity to it.
Final question for you, Cathy. We talked a little bit earlier about hope, and bringing hope to the whole issue of climate change. Are you hopeful in relation to the prospects of effectively turning the ship around, as it were, and dealing effectively with climate change?
I've learned that hope isn't really about trusting that the outcome is going to be good, because there's some days I'm hopeful in that way and some days I'm not. There are days when I'm like, oh, this is going to be hard, and other days when I'm like, yeah, we just might make it, but what I've learned is that hope isn't really about trusting that outcome will be good. It's about having that vision of the way forward. It's about having that vision of a better way of doing things, and it's about having people to walk on that journey with you. I've heard over and over, and it's true in my experience, that as soon as you start to connect with other people who find this to be just as important and are committing their lives to this work, that creates this kind of energy that goes way beyond any kind of despair. And it's, as people say, it's also just more fun, right? So then you're doing the work together, and that then the end result of it doesn't matter as much as we're going to be faithful to the task. And then I've also, I guess I'll just end with I heard another climate activist recently say that we don't really need hope. What we need is courage. What we need is the courage to take action even when we don't feel hopeful. And I really think that echoes my experience of just really getting beyond my own despair and having the courage and starting in my own community where it was safe. And that courage and that practice has led and given me the courage to go on and do more. So.
Cathy, you are an incredible inspiration, and we are so grateful for your time on Tower Talk today to tell us about the work that you're doing with climate change, and your role with MNIPL and within the United Methodist United Methodist Church. And we certainly look forward to following what's to come for you and all the work that you're doing in the community. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to tell you about it. So.
So Cathy Velasquez Eberhart, again, on the board of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light and part of the United Methodist Church Earth Keepers programming. And you'll find more information about Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light on their website at MNIPL.org. You can also learn more about the Minnesota United Methodist Church Earth Keepers program by going to minnesotaumc.org/Hopeful Earth and searching for Earth Keepers. And you'll also find episodes of Tower Talk on the Prospect Park United Methodist Church website at prospectparkchurch.org, and you can sign up there to become part of our email list. My thanks to the Tower Talk production team, Angela and A.K. Head Vincent, Cassie Davis Junkies, and Reverend Chris Gleason Wehrman. For all of us, I'm Dave Nyberg. Thanks for joining us for Tower Talk.